Welcome to Middle East Briefing. The content of the briefing includes: Blinken arrives in Saudi Arabia amid a surge in regional violence. Blinken's Mideast visit and U.S. aid to Israel are the focus in Washington this week. U.S. vows Middle East strikes while trying to avert wider war. Live updates: Israeli strikes raise Gaza death toll as Blinken heads to Mideast. U.S. strikes in the Middle East will not change Biden's re-election fortunes. Blinken arrives in Saudi Arabia amid a surge in regional violence. Washington Post. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Saudi Arabia on Monday, saying that the U.S. seeks a de-escalation in the conflict between U.S. forces and Iranian-backed proxy groups. This comes after the U.S. launched dozens of strikes on militia targets on Friday, in response to the killing of 3 U.S. service members in Jordan on January 28. The U.S. has declined to strike targets inside Iran, as doing so would likely prompt further attacks on U.S. personnel in the region. U.S. officials are seeking to advance a potential hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, which they hope could develop into a permanent ceasefire. Blinken's Mideast visit and U.S. aid to Israel are the focus in Washington this week. New York Times. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to visit the Middle East this week to continue talks on a possible ceasefire deal in Gaza. Blinken will visit Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and the Israeli-occupied West Bank in an effort to secure the release of remaining hostages in Gaza and secure a humanitarian pause for civilians. Hamas has said it is considering a ceasefire proposal, but has signaled that there are still significant gaps to bridge. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council will gather on Monday to discuss U.S. strikes in response to a deadly drone attack. Russia has accused the U.S. of escalating conflict in the Middle East. Further retaliation is possible this week, with the U.S. national security officials saying that President Biden has approved additional actions. Senate Republicans and Democrats have also introduced a $118.3 billion compromise bill on migration that includes aid for Israel and civilians in conflict zones including Gaza. U.S. vows Middle East strikes while trying to avert wider war. South China Morning Post. The U.S. is set to launch more attacks on Iran-backed forces in the Middle East following 3 days of strikes, according to the Biden administration. Senior officials have said that the country will respond forcefully to further attacks, while also emphasizing that the U.S. does not want to be embroiled in a prolonged regional conflict. The U.S. has already targeted 85 sites in Iraq and Syria, as well as attacking Houthi rebels in Yemen. The expanded target list indicates a broadening of the U.S. campaign, and Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, has refused to rule out attacks on Iran itself. The U.S. sees the Houthis as adapting, with the group becoming increasingly skilled at targeting vessels, although it cannot currently overcome U.S. defenses. Ali al-Qahom, a member of the Houthi Political Council, claimed that there was now an open war and that the group has the military capability to fight back. Live updates: Israeli strikes raise Gaza death toll as Blinken heads to Mideast. Associated Press. The Israeli military is working to root out the leaders of Hamas and to destroy the militant group that attacked southern Israel almost 4 months ago. Strikes hit 2 houses and a mosque in central Gaza on Sunday, killing 29 people and wounding at least 60 others. Separate airstrikes in Rafah, the enclave's southernmost city, killed 2 children, ages 12 and 2. The offensive in Gaza that Israel launched in response to the attack had killed 27,365 people and wounded more than 66,000 in Gaza as of Sunday morning, the Hamas-ruled territory's health ministry reported. U.S. strikes in the Middle East will not change Biden's re-election fortunes. Al Jazeera. The U.S. conducted air raids on sites in Syria and Iraq that it said belonged to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, and affiliated militias. The air raids were in retaliation for an attack by the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, IRI, on a military base in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers and injured over 40 others. U.S. President Joe Biden said the response would not stop at IRGC targets. On Saturday, American and British forces bombarded Houthi bases in Yemen in an apparent continuation of efforts to degrade their ability to disrupt maritime shipping in the Red Sea. The U.S. is refraining from directly hitting Iran, which it accuses of supplying weapons to IRI. A military response was politically unavoidable for the Biden administration. The measured retaliation reflects the fact that the U.S. president has a lot to worry about in terms of domestic perceptions and the attitudes of voters he seeks to sway in his favor, as well as the dramatic changes in his own party's electorate. The two-state solution is a recipe for carnage. Foreign policy. World leaders have consistently called for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but this idea is problematic and could lead to catastrophic consequences. The two-state solution, which was first proposed by the United States over 3 decades ago, has long been considered dead and buried. Reviving this proposal highlights the inability of world leaders to come up with a more credible response to the conflict. Furthermore, if a two-state solution were to be imposed, it would likely result in a new Nakba, or catastrophe, that would be even worse than the previous ones. The partition of India in 1947 serves as a cautionary tale for the potential consequences of a two-state solution. The division of Muslims and Hindus led to widespread violence and the displacement of millions of people. The two states that emerged, India and Pakistan, have since experienced a long history of hostility and periodic clashes. The Middle East, with its history of hostility and mutual hatred, is even more prone to violence, and the creation of two separate states could lead to even greater bloodshed. There are other potential solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that should be explored. While these alternatives, such as confederations or single-state models, are challenging and require concessions from both sides, they offer a more realistic and potentially less disastrous outcome than the two-state solution. It is time to withdraw the idea of a two-state solution from the political discourse and consider other options that could lead to a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. U.S. says strikes on Iran-linked sites just beginning. BBC. The White House has warned that its airstrikes on Iran-backed targets in Iraq and Syria are just the beginning, not the end of its response to Iran. The U.S. is responding to the deaths of 3 soldiers in an enemy drone attack on a military base in Jordan last week. Though Iran denies involvement, its affiliate the Islamic Resistance in Iraq has claimed responsibility. The U.S. accuses Tehran of having its fingerprints on the attack and said the drone was Iranian-made. Attack on U.S. base in Syria kills Kurdish fighters. Al Jazeera. A drone strike on a U.S. military base in eastern Syria killed several Kurdish-led forces, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, SOHR. The UK-based group said that 7 fighters were killed and 18 injured. Iran-aligned armed groups retaliated with strikes on U.S. bases in Syria, as well as western and northern Iraq. The strikes come following a drone attack on a U.S. base in Jordan, which killed 3 soldiers, and American retaliatory strikes on Iran-backed groups in Iraq and Syria. A guide to the key players in the Israel-Gaza war and how they're stoking the conflict. ABC. The article provides a brief overview of the escalating Israel-Gaza war and the involvement of key actors in the conflict. The war began when Hamas, supported by Iran, launched an assault on Israel, prompting a violent response from Israel and its allies, including the U.S. The conflict has further stoked violence in countries like Lebanon and Jordan and in the Red Sea, raising fears of a wider war in the Middle East. The article highlights the complex history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the opposing forces involved. On one side, there is the powerful Israel-US alliance, supported by Saudi Arabia, which seeks to prevent Iran's influence in the region. On the other side is the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network of state and non-state actors funded by Iran, including Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Islamic Resistance in Iraq. The article also provides a brief overview of the involvement of key actors such as Israel, Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Qatar. Overall, the article aims to provide some background and context to the ongoing conflict in the region. Cohen of Goldman Sachs surveys top global challenges. Transcript. Bloomberg. Jared Cohen, president of global affairs for Goldman Sachs, has spoken about the geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges the world is facing in an interview with Bloomberg News. Cohen stated that the recent tensions in the Middle East are a geopolitical test for the region and that there is a stark divide between countries with Iranian proxy activities and those that are economically divorced from geopolitical issues, such as the wealthy Gulf states. Cohen does not believe that there will be a full-scale war across the Middle East and North Africa but rather a continued expansion of proxy activities. He also warned that the geopolitical instability between the US and China is likely to persist and have ripple effects throughout the global economy. Cohen mentioned that a key geoeconomic challenge the world faces is the diversification of supply chains and the risk that geopolitical aspirations may outpace the economic realities of what is possible. He also discussed the concept of geopolitical swing states, using India as an example, and how countries like India and the Gulf Arab states are asserting themselves more independently in the geopolitical sphere. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your favorite resident observer from the 6 Degrees World, Dr. Six. Today, I bring you a whirlwind of news from the Middle East that has left everyone on edge. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Saudi Arabia, the escalating violence between U.S. forces and Iranian-backed groups, the Israeli-Gaza conflict, and the potential consequences of a two-state solution are all hot topics. Let's start with Secretary Blinken's visit. He's on a mission to seek a de-escalation in the conflict and advance a potential hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. It's a tough challenge, considering the deep-rooted tensions in the region. Meanwhile, the U.S. is vowing more strikes on Iran-backed forces, but they're also trying to avoid getting embroiled in a prolonged conflict. It's a delicate balancing act. Speaking of the Israeli-Gaza conflict, it's a mess. The Israeli military is determined to root out Hamas leaders and destroy the militant group. But the strikes have led to a significant number of casualties, including innocent civilians. It's a tragic situation that shows no signs of abating. Now, let's talk about the controversial two-state solution. World leaders have been pushing for this solution for decades, but is it really the answer? Some experts argue that it could lead to even greater violence and bloodshed, citing the partition of India in 1947 as a cautionary tale. They suggest exploring alternative options like confederations or single-state models. It's time to think outside the box and come up with a more realistic solution. In the midst of all this chaos, Jared Cohen from Goldman Sachs has weighed in on the global challenges we're facing. He believes that the recent tensions in the Middle East are a geopolitical test and that we'll see a continuation of proxy activities rather than a full-scale war. He also highlights the importance of diversifying supply chains and the risk of geopolitical aspirations outpacing economic realities. Wow, that was a lot to digest. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you make of these developments? Do you have any alternative solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Let's dive into a lively discussion, my dear viewers. Dr. Six is all ears. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.